I'm going to take a break from the tradition which starts with "my next guest needs no introduction" and then proceeds with a great catalogue of stuff which everybody but hermits knows about him, or her. My guest is Conrad Black. Just a reminder, publisher, commentator, author, historian, and altogether profligate in how much he has to say and write, and an eager, unsleeping warrior in today's testy political climate. It's a treat to have him. I'm just going to start out on an easy track, and it's a genuine question. I'm not playing. How do you write so damn much? You have the columns are all over the place. I read them in New English Review, and I can read them in the States, and I read them in the Post. But then you slap out these books every year. Where do you get the prodigious stamina to carry on all this stuff? I'm serious.
Yeah, the books get smaller and smaller. That one didn't take long. No, I can't crank out a big book every year. Although I'm working on a big book now, but it'll take a while. The columns, things set. I'm just an observant reader and watcher of the news, and there are lots of things that give rise to a column, and I can usually rattle these things out fairly fast. And I have, I think, a bit of a niche in that I usually put a historic aspect to it. And most commentators aren't particularly historically minded. So I'm not saying it's a good thing, but it's almost a unique thing. I mean, in the United States, only Victor Hansen, up to a point George will, ever refer to history. And Victor often refers to classical history.
Yes, he does.
But, I have a fair background in the history of Canada, Britain, the United States, and France, and a few other places.
No, it is very interesting. Again, the discipline required, put out a massive biography, for example. I mean,
that took a lot of work.
That frightens me.
Roosevelt and Nixon were big books, and that took a lot of time to research them.
So is this your cardinal taste? You were the businessman, obviously, for years and years and years. But was there always the itch to scribble, to use a phrase?
Yes, and I had to refine my style a bit. I don't frankly think I was particularly good at writing for a newspaper for a long time, and I benefited from my wife's advice, who's a very accomplished columnist. And yes, it is. Although I am trying to rebuild my means, so I do spend a fair bit of time on commercial matters, but I don't have to sit and actually run a business. I'm an investor, and my son works with me, and I'm active, but I have plenty of time to write.
Who are the main satellites in your imagination when it comes to writing? Is it? I'm making some guesses. Some Gibbon, some Macaulay, some Churchill, or does it go wider than that?
No, it's maybe pretentious to say this, but Gibbon is a little wordy for me.
Good for you.
And Macaulay is a pithier writer, but I'm suspicious of Whig utilitarians. And I think he engaged in a terrible amount of myth making, especially about the so-called Glorious Revolution.
But he was a machine for rhetoric.
He's very, very good at it, yes. Let me see. Look, it may not be clear to any reader, but Cardinal Newman, Saint John Cardinal Newman, and George Orwell, I would say, would be, and it's adapted, but Albert Camus too.
Okay. That's really interesting.
Would be the ones I would mention most. But in saying that, at replicating the quality of their prose, I'm a complete failure.
No, I was just wondering because
as for a public person, you mentioned Mr. Churchill. More Abraham Lincoln. I think he was a wonderful wordsmith.
He was the better writer of the two.
Yes. I obviously we don't know exactly how he spoke, though obviously he was very effective. But and he actually put lines of poetry in
famous speech.
Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away.
And that every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be paid for one drawn by the sword. There's a phrase.
What about for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live, using the same word as a verb, and it's a very artistic way to do it.
In my thoughts about the two of them, Churchill obviously had the moment. They both had the moment, which amplifies the power of great words. Events also charge language.
Roosevelt and de Gaulle were wonderful speakers, too. Okay. Roosevelt's address at D-Day beginning, "Our sons, pride of our nation," and ending, "Our sons and allies will build a world, a peace invulnerable to the schemings of unworthy men." It was inspiring.
Well, speaking of the schemings of unworthy men,
a frequent topic.
Well, yeah, we can go both directions here. We're doing this, I'll mention this so it'll be clear in future days. We're doing this on the day that Andrew Scheer resigned, was ejected, we'll learn more later, as leader of the party. This is even in a mixed up politics such as we got, this is a bit of a tumult, is it not?
You mean an unnecessarily abrupt exit?
Yeah.
Yes, I think so. Again, like you, I don't know the circumstances, but it seems to me, at the very least, he deserved a dignified departure. I mean, he did win the popular vote. He did bring the party up, 27 MPs, I think?
Yeah, he did.
I mean, it was a disappointing campaign, but it wasn't a fiasco.
It was a better campaign than Trudeau's or Jagmeet Singh's if you look at the percentage rises or losses.
Yeah, indeed. But he may have felt ultimately that he just didn't want to get into the tug of war about staying any longer, I just don't know the facts. There may be things we don't know.
Well, I'm going to go now to the other border, because down there, meaning the United States, and you've been one of the singular defenders, and in this country you would be the singular defender, almost from the start, or if not from the start, of President Trump. Why is there such frantic opposition? And I said frantic, not just opposition.
Yes.
Why does he draw such universal, almost, venom?
Now, do you mean in the United States or in Canada?
And here. You can't
It's certainly not universal venom in the United States. Half the people would follow him anywhere.
I'm more speaking about the writers and the columnists and the journalists.
Well, you see, I must say, by complete happenstance, that's been a bonanza for me, because all of those amongst whom I swam as a small fish in the sea of great highbrow writers, all defected except for Victor Hansen and Roger Kimball. And so I'm left as a sort of eminent figure among the relatively highbrow defenders of a president who has an extraordinarily good record. I mean, which would be a terrible thing, but if he died today, he would have served longer than John F. Kennedy, and he would have had one of the, I would say, 5 or 6 most successful single terms of any president in history. In policy terms, he's been very successful. And but to answer your question about why it is unique in the why my status is unusual, at least, in the United States, we have to remember he ran against everybody. He ran against all factions of both parties, so everybody was there disliked him.
And 17 nominees in the Republic.
Yes, exactly. And when I knew that this was not just a brand building exercise, was when in Massachusetts, which is of course a Democratic state, but even the Republicans, 35 to 40% of the people who are Republican in that state are leftish Republicans, and running against 6 prominent Republicans, governors or senators, Kasich and Rubio and Bush and so on. He got 49% of the vote. I said to my wife, Donald has hit a vein here that no one knew existed. Either that or he's pulling a lot of voters who haven't been in the habit of voting and haven't been canvassed by the polls because they're not in the habit of voting. And that has proved to be the case. But those who dislike him in the U.S. are those who feel, in my judgment, either dispossessed by him and or appalled by his what they would regard as his garish behavior. And I cannot sit here and tell you hand over heart that there's no reason to regard it as that. I mean, it sometimes phases even me.
There are moments.
Yeah, I mean, often it's hilarious and amusing. And in general, I like anyone who shakes up that complacent political establishment that so horribly misgoverned the country.
Well, isn't that, just to stop you there, isn't that the core of this? I've always thought that Trump's emergence, and then he was especially antagonistic to certain minds, was that what used to be called in a faded time the silent majority were getting very irritated by all the people who knew so much better than they. And along comes this glass breaker, and they said, okay, here's the guy we want, as opposed to you.
Yeah. Rex, let me cite one statistic. GDP growth per capita in the United States was 4.5% under Reagan, 3.9% under Clinton, 2% under George W. Bush, and 1% under Obama. You could see where it was headed. And the whole American mythos, as you know, is built on progress, hard work, exceptionalism, meritocracy, and if you did your best and were good at what you did, things would get better, and things would get better for the country generally. And we were hearing about a flatlined new normal.
Yeah.
And the workforce was shrinking, the crime rate was rising, and nobody was getting anywhere in the lower echelons of the socioeconomic scale. And there were 1 million illegal immigrants coming in every year in this cynical collaboration between Democrats who wanted the votes of these non-citizens, but they voted anyway, and Republican employers who wanted to pay them rock-bottom wages in the so-called hospitality industry in particular. But not this, leaving out, the Barbra Streisands and so on, higher than the roller tennis courts. But and Trump finally blew the whistle on the whole thing. And it was a remarkable thing and is a tremendous achievement of American democracy. Leaving out the stylistic infelicities of the president at times, that there was this person who only person in the history of the country who never held either a military command or attempted any public office, elected or unelected, who could just stand up there and say, this won't fly, it won't do.
I want to get that's the other element I want to hear you on. Most people pass by the remarkable, I'm going to call it a gift, maybe it's luck, the remarkable ability of someone who was then 67, 68 when he more or less got into this, hadn't run for office as much as town councillor, takes on the professional apparatus of two parties. And let's not forget that he challenged Madam Socialist, Mrs. Clinton, the greatest nominee in the history of the country. How someone who was totally outside the field of practice won over all the people who were the skilled practitioners. Does anyone admire the genius of this, or is it all supposed to be blind luck?
No, that wasn't like luck. I've known him a long time, and he was always doing polling, even in the late 90s. He changed parties 7 times in 13 years. He was like a big cat, seeing the one wildebeest it's going to get and just moving around until it can do it, you see. He realized he won the Progressive Party primaries, and I think Michigan and California, and in I believe 1996, and then he withdrew because he saw no third party candidate ever wins in the United States, not even Theodore Roosevelt. It just doesn't happen. So he had to get one of the parties, and he kept maneuvering to see which one, and then he made his move, and he plotted it all out. He did it all with the staff. He got his ideas watching the television on his plane going between campaign stops, when he was running in the primaries. And he had a staff of about 8 people. My friend Mark Stein told me that he went to a rally that Trump had in New Hampshire, and he was talking to Mark and a number of other people, and then they heard in the background whoever was the sort of chairman of this meeting with 15,000 people, saying, and it is now my privilege to present the next president of the United States. At this point, Trump said, wait a minute, I think I'm being introduced. Stay here. I want to finish this. I'll be back after I've spoken. And there were no aides running around with things connected to their ears. He walked out and waved and shook hands with a few people, spoke for about an hour, really stirred it up, as he always does. He came back and finished the thing. He had no assistants around or anything. And he's a rich man. He could afford it if he wanted to.
Well, that's another small point there, but not so small, actually. You mentioned assistants. the fact that modern leadership, go back, remember you were talking about Lincoln, you're talking about Churchill, they wrote their own stuff at a very busy time. They had the business.
Roosevelt often did.
They had, but I'm saying they had busy schedules. They didn't need to have a fleet of speechwriters. But in the case of Trump, the very fact that he was, let's put this word in there, unprofessional, completely unprofessional, was actually a cleansing of the political process. We've farmed it out. We've contracted it out to so-called the mercenaries of the speechwriters and the posters. That's what's draining politics of some of its authenticity. It's all secondhand thought.
There's a lot of that. The other thing to remember in Trump's case is the 20 years that preceded him, in my opinion, were the 20 years of the greatest presidential misgovernment in American history. I think what went on, with the Great Recession and the endless wars in the Middle East and the humanitarian tragedies, all the illegal immigration and all of it, it was worse than the 10 years before the Civil War, and it was worse than the 3 terms between Wilson and Roosevelt that gave us the Great Depression. It was terrible government, and I think, I don't say this out of any personal dislike, but I think George W. Bush and Obama were seriously incompetent presidents. I think that would be an overstatement in the case of Bill Clinton and unjust in the case of George Bush Sr. But between Reagan and Trump, the condition of the country deteriorated terribly. And Americans, as I was saying earlier, they're not like Europeans who are accustomed to the ups and downs of the country. If the United States isn't, and they accept there are fluctuations, but it isn't fundamentally a country of which they can say our best days are still ahead of us and my children will live better than we did. They are not going to sit there and tolerate it like cynical Frenchmen. I'm not so sure the French would tolerate it so easily either, but they get extremely agitated. And you did ask about Canada. That's a separate case, obviously. Trump isn't here anything other than the head of the great American spectacle of which we have the ringside seat. But Canadians always, and indeed foreigners generally, always like to disparage American presidents. They only like strong presidents when they need them to be strong, like Roosevelt, or inoffensive presidents who are not in the slightest bit assertive of the American interest, like Jimmy Carter. Pierre Trudeau, to his dying day, never understood why the Americans thought Reagan was a better president than Carter. And Obama was popular because he was always apologizing for his predecessors and claiming the United States had a lot to learn from Europe.
And also he was a convenient object for displaying your bona fides on very delicate issues.
Okay, exactly. Yeah. Which, by the way, was an authentic thing. The fact the United States elected a non-white president is a great thing, I think. But he was, unfortunately, he wasn't a good president.
It's not marked enough. Let's just jump to another part of this. You own them. You had a long tradition with media, particularly newspapers. When I look down at the States, and to some fair degree here too, how much of the press decided that they're actually, I'll use this phrase a lot, that they're actually not reporting the game, they're in the game, that they're players too. All this business with Trump since his own election, the press are not the medium in the middle. The press are participants in the action. When did the press bend so much that it figures we're the determiners as well as the politicians?
Yeah, and you have an overt statement in the New York Times that they're not going to report objectively. They're going to report tendentiously. Well, like Trump's a special case. In fairness, he when he ran not only against all factions of both parties and the Bushes as much as the Clintons and Obama. He ran against the whole power structure, the lobby system, the election campaign finance system, the national political media. He ran against all of it. And you would know, Rex, as well as I would, that the media do like their role of being able to elevate and promote people in public esteem. So he was directly challenging them and using social media to end-run them. Social media and his influence in the talk radio circuit, Rush Limbaugh and people like Laura Ingraham and so on. he was basically challenging their influence, and they didn't like it. And then, no doubt, there were other factors as well. And they have essentially, as far as I can see, except for Rupert Murdoch, they've pushed all their chips onto the side of the opposition, and they have a lot riding on this. And as time goes by and we get a clearer and clearer revelation of the enormities that were committed in the complete fraud of the Russian-Trump collusion scam, they are getting more and more embarrassed. And all these surveys show that public credibility of the national political media is under 15%.
I think not bad. It's almost fatal. I want to hang on to that. It's one thing where you'd have a CNN executive who owns the damn company. Trump is fighting. I agree with you totally, by the way. He ran against all of them. Well, I go down to the level of individual journalists, columnists. Mm-hmm. It is no longer, even those who are columnists, which are opinion, obviously, they act as if they're in this process, that they're not the observer, they're not the transmitter, and they're not the straight commentator.
There's a surrealistic unreality about the way. I mean, Tom Friedman's piece in the New York Times yesterday of saying we must impeach this man. I mean, at no point did he say he'd committed a crime. At no point did he say they connect anything Trump had done to the Constitution specifically. He just said he had tried to extort a political favor from a foreign government, and therefore he should be removed from office. Well, of course, he didn't do anything of the kind. They didn't conduct the investigation he requested, and he did release the aid that was at issue. He didn't connect the two, and he wasn't asking for the crucifixion of Biden. He was asking for an investigation to determine whether Biden had been influence peddling or not, and his son. And I mean, what is wrong with that? The answer is nothing is wrong with it, but it's grasping at straws to create a completely confected and phony climate of moral fraudulence and decay about somebody. And it won't work. It's not working. It's clearly not working. And they get more desperate each time around, you see.
This is speculation. I also agree. I don't think it's going to work, but again, we'll see how things turn. But let's put this as just to posit this. Do they realize, I'm thinking of the Democrats in this particular context, do they realize what the outcome would be if indeed they had the success that they say they want? If they impeach this president before the next election, do they think it would be docilely received by the American population?
Well, he'd run again. He'd get the nomination, he'd run again, and he'd win.
Yeah, but I'm thinking even deeper than that. If you throw out the guy that we put in to tick you off, I'm thinking of his constituents, the ones who really rallied around him. Yes. They're not going to like this. This is playing with fire.
Oh, it certainly is. I mean, if you're suggesting there would be general violence, I doubt that, because I think he would seek the Republican nomination and get it and win the election. But if they managed to push him out in a way that kept him out, then I don't know how much violence there would be, but it would really be a terribly divided.
It would be seismic for sure.
Look, the other, I mean, these what ifs are, I guess, unproductive by nature. But does anyone ever imagine what would have happened if Hillary had won? I mean, the Clinton pay-to-play casino would have sold the roof off the White House by now. I mean, you know, it would have been an absolute outrage.
Why is it? It staggers me in some ways. There are so many, I think, legitimate and grounded lines of inquiry into the Clinton Foundation, into Hillary Clinton, into the all of these things, which some people paint as conspiracy. They just drift by. Nothing happens.
I don't know. I don't know if she's going to drift right through it, though. You know, the uranium thing, I think she's all right on. There were 11 cabinet officers or cabinet level people who signed that thing, and the uranium itself doesn't leave the country. It's just a shareholding.
Yeah.
I think, you know, I think they can get by on that, although the optics, as they say, are not terribly good. 131 million from my friend Frank Juster, you know, who's a very generous man, but still.
Yeah, that's a bit.
But the. On her knowledge of the Steele dossier, which she was paying for, we haven't heard the last of that. I mean, the special counsel is going through all that, and I I wouldn't be so sure that the Clintons are going to get out of that without a little mud splattered on them. I mean, you note that Horowitz himself said yesterday that anyone corrected with the Hurricane Crossfire should not be complacent about what's going to happen next. And I saw that Lindsey Graham on Hannity's program last night said he was going to, if necessary, subpoena Rosenstein. The flames are crackling in the straw here, and if the Clintons can't hear it, they'd better get a hearing aid.
Well, I only have one more on U.S. politics, but I go back, we're still on Hillary, on this server thing. Once it became common news that the Secretary of State, which is the highest officer, I think, next to President, even Vice President.
Constitutionally, she's next in succession to the deputy.
Prestige and power.
Yeah. It's the premier cabinet position,
That she would assume exemption from the confidentiality rules of her own department and her own government, the most powerful government in the world, and she would put a computer server unsecured by any standards of government thing. That's a crime.
That's a crime. Lying repeatedly to government agents, in this case the director of the FBI, that's a crime too. Now, he didn't take the normal precaution of swearing her as a witness, but still lying to a federal agent is a crime in the United States. I mean, I think she's a sitting duck. And I don't think I don't think she's got to the limitations on that. I mean, I believe it's 5-year limitation for a thing like that, and it isn't 5 years.
The tag question only, is it a joke or is it real? Her name keeps popping out now that the Democrats have the multitude of strange people running for president, that she is still there waiting. Is that a possibility?
I don't think so. I think, first of all, her legal situation is too precarious. Second, I don't think her health is good. Third, I think her popularity has vanished, really. I mean, she was the feminist candidate. Now she's seen as not a particularly good feminist by current rather belligerent standards, and I think they've moved on. I mean, she's vieux, she's just a passé person. I mean, nothing wrong with it. She had a long career.
I know partially the answer to this because I read what you write. What do you think? I'm jumping. What do you think of the kind of impassioned, politicized environmentalist movement that is A, global, and B, in Canada, that part of
It's nonsense. Canada? It's just nonsense.
Expand.
Well, look, if what we had here, we're talking about Canada now, what was a powerful demand specifically to assure that all sewage is treated completely and that all industrial smoke is treated completely, I would be in the cheering section for that. I'd be 100% for it. But the idea that the greatest public policy goal of this country is, and I quote, to fight climate change, is one of the stupidest enunciations of public policy I've ever heard. And like yourself and any experienced person, we've heard some real lulus, and that's one of them. I mean, we don't know if it is changing outside traditional cyclic occurrences. We don't know the extent or speed it's changing at, if it really is changing. We don't know and have absolutely no indicative or persuasive evidence at all of the extent to which it's anthropogenically caused by people. And we don't know if it's a bad thing. I mean, I don't see the reasoning behind the theory that a 1 centigrade degree move in 80 years it constitutes some dangerous shift, let alone a so-called hockey stick, which has been debunked. And two, if you live in Canada, particularly in a day like today where I had to put a sweater on to come down here under an overcoat, that a degree or two wouldn't be such a terrible thing.
I'm from Newfoundland.
Yeah, well, you get pretty nippy down there.
I've been praying for it for a long while.
I mean, I don't mean to be flippant. Obviously, if the climate is changing, we want to know it, but we don't know it. And if you look under this truism that 98% of scientists agree with. It's complete rubbish. They don't. And they've quarreled violently among themselves. The head of the Meteorological Association of Japan a couple of months ago said the whole thing is bunk. I've been trying to research it for 30 years, and we haven't a clue what's going on. All these measurements of ocean temperature, different depths and all over the different oceans, and they don't produce any coherent result at all. And the alarmists, are like the little boy crying wolf. I mean, Al Gore told us the country of Tuvalu would be underwater years ago. It's actually got, more clearance than it had 20 years ago. The Prince of Wales told us we'd all be swimming by several years ago, and if we are, it's in our swimming pools.
And there will be no more snow was predicted in 2001.
The polar bear would be out of business. The Himalayan glaciers would all have melted. It's all bunk.
Now, this is very interesting. You're one of the very few people, not flattery, just straight talk. You're one of the very few people who says clearly, and with some reasonable intensity, that this is all garbage. You realize how much of a heresy this is?
Well, I'm afraid I do. But it
is a serious thing.
So was the theory that the Earth was round. But,
Well, why is that? Why can't you have conflict?
You see, now this is an interesting question. The despotic and totalitarian intellectual rule of the climate change and particularly global warming theory is really confined to Western Europe and Canada. The Americans don't buy it. Some do and some don't, but the government doesn't, and the country doesn't reproach the government for pulling out of Paris. The climate agreement. No one's asking them not to go to that splendid city. The Japanese haven't bought it. The Australians rejected it in their election earlier this year, and obviously Russia, India, and China just think it's a load of eyewash. They don't buy into any of it, and they say, "Well, you're just all hypocrites who polluted the atmosphere to your heart's content when you were industrializing, and now are trying to prevent us from doing the same thing." I think we have to examine how this all got going. My view is that conservation is a good thing, and the old Greenpeace people were very tiresome when they harassed American aircraft carriers and things, but at least they were sort of sincere environmentalists, and all the bird watchers and butterfly collectors and so on were good people. But all of a sudden, the whole movement was overwhelmed by the spontaneous arrival of the defeated legions of the international left at the end of the Cold War, who happened upon it as a respectable way to assault capitalism from a different angle, claiming they were saving the planet doing it. And it had nothing to do with ideology. So we got this tremendous magnification of the numbers and volume behind what was, in fact, a reputable, reasonable thing of people trying to make sure there was marshland for ducks and that air and water pollution were reduced as much as could be. And a reasonable thing was suddenly taken over by people with a devious purpose.
How is it that this particular, I'm putting the italics there, cause receives such submission from so many sources? Corporations have, if you go into a hotel room now, they tell you not to wash the sheets because you're saving the planet. Everyone wants to give the signal that they agree with this catastrophic theory.
You don't count on business for courage. I am a capitalist, but businessmen are, for the most part, in political terms, cowards and idiots.
I'm not stopping at businessmen. You go into any major mainstream mainstream news source, be it broadcasting or newspaper, they're almost to a single one. They genuflect. They have climate weeks. They stuff their weather reports with, this must be climate. What is the genuflection reflex here on this damn theory? Why are so many people, that's why I singled you out. You just said something so strong in this context that you're radical. And you would be shunned by half the dinner tables of this city.
I could console myself. I can't mind read a huge various group like that, but once a truism becomes accepted public truth, the conventional wisdom, it's difficult to undermine it. But remember, we're talking about Canada and Western Europe, and not all of Western Europe. the British are giving it lip service at the moment, but there's plenty of skepticism about it there, and I think it's the nature of these movements that when they're not really firmly based logically in fact, they become more fanatical and tyrannical as time passes and their position becomes more tenuous. And that's what's happening now. I mean, now we actually are submitted to the spectacle of this Swedish
Greta.
girl going out being proclaimed by the not dead yet Time magazine. Some of us long for it to join Newsweek, but as the personality of the year.
Yeah.
And here she is up giving speeches and being approved and proclaimed by such organizations as Time magazine so laudatorily for assaulting all of us who are adults in the advanced world, for bequeathing to her and her generation a mortally damaged world because of our ecological recklessness. But you pull yourself together and don't talk to us like that. You get the hell out and work for a living, and we'll listen to you 30 years from now or something. Instead of that, we have this absolutely unimaginable deference to this robotic outlet for absolute rubbish.
But not only that, it's not only the deference in general, deference in some of the highest parliaments and the Congress and going to before the European Union.
Yes and no, though. I mean, Nigel Lawson, who was a very respected former chancellor, wrote a book about it, and he led the House of Lords. That's how I was involved in this in a very minor way. Committee on this and went very carefully through everything and wrote an excellent book saying how unsound the tenets of these alarmist theories are, and that's he's not the only person in the British Parliament who holds that view, and it certainly, I think it was quite clear that the majority of legislators in the United States in both houses were not signing on to that. That's why Obama couldn't put the Paris climate agreement adherence to the Congress, and he couldn't even put his green legislation. He couldn't get that through, even when he had a pretty strong position in the Congress. The votes weren't there. Now, Canada is different, and the reasons for that would be complicated.
Okay. On Canada, though, specifically, there has been a very distinct price for the elevation of the climate issue, in particular by the present government. Mr. Butts was especially their advisor. That price has been...
Following his howling success at Queen's Park.
The decimation of Alberta's principal industry and the estrangement of that province and some other areas out west as well from the national idea. Environmentalism is not free. It has other results. Those results translate into the political mess that we're in here now. What has been, in your read, how much damage has been done to the cardinal industry of this country because of this fantastic embrace of a fantastic idea?
Well, terrible damage. It could be put right very quickly if there's a will to do it. Now, in the United States, they are now an energy exporter for the first time in 70 years. This is to a degree, it must be said, a bipartisan thing. I mean, George W. Bush, the oil imports were 15 million barrels a day, and he brought them down to 10. Obama brought them down to 5, and Trump's eliminated them, and it's an exporter. They added 151,000 jobs in the energy sector in the United States last year. Now, we could do the same thing if we had the policies to support that. And Obama was not a pipeline builder. I mean, his success was more or less accidental. But in that area. But terrible damage has been done, and the Albertans in particular have a very legitimate and profound grievance against the federal government of this country. But even more sinister from a pan-Canadian standpoint, in my opinion, is what's going on in Quebec. I mean, they're clearly imposing upon the population of Quebec higher costs for gasoline and home heating fuel as part of a nationalist campaign masquerading as an ecological matter. And in my opinion, it is a very sinister thing. And because this federal government has been so fiscally incompetent, if there is another question put to the voters of Quebec on whether they wish to remain in Canada or not, unlike the first two referendums, which were close enough, especially the second one, although the questions were a bit ambiguous, the economic argument would be with the nationalists in Quebec. They'd be saying we can have a country of our own, and in addition, you get a tax cut. And this is, I think the artificially escalated opposition in Quebec to receiving cheaper energy by pipeline from elsewhere in Canada is part of a campaign to look for a casus belli with the federal government. And now that Justin is relying on the Bloc Québécois to sustain him in Parliament, it is a perfect storm of bad things for federalism.
And I'll add one more element and see if you agree with the thought. Prior referenda were their own thing. Now that you have another wall of sentiment in another part of the country springing from totally different reasons.
Yes.
But nonetheless, it would be to the advantage of those in Quebec who want sovereignty to antagonize that bunch and vice versa in a certain kind of way. In other words,
and the federal government has absolutely no experience at all trying to deal with secessionist crises in two regions at once. And even if our greatest leaders in the past were called upon to do it, it would be a challenge. And I personally like Justin Trudeau, but he is not a strong leader. And he is absolutely not equipped to deal with this, in my opinion.
When you say, and it's obvious that he has to have support in Parliament from some elements in Quebec, how does he...
Well, he's got a fair number of MPs of his own. He'd have them, but he could have... He didn't have to hand out much to, I mean, I don't approve of this, but he didn't have to hand out much to the NDP to get their vote. But instead, he's leaning on the Bloc Québécois.
What's your estimation of how Jason Kenney is performing?
I think he's doing very well. I think he's in the difficult position of being a sincere federalist, but an Albertan who feels deeply precisely the problems that you mentioned. And he is trying to approach it aggressively but responsibly. I think he's done very well. I happened to meet the energy minister in Alberta, new Sonia. I forget her last name right now, but she's very impressive. Mm-hmm. Very impressive person. I met a couple of his other ministers, and I know Jason. I'm very impressed with this government, but they've got a difficult time. There's no doubt about that.
And we mentioned it earlier with Mr. Scheer resigning. The Tories, for the moment at least, kind of left in some sort of small void. Is Kenney, even on the federal scene, is he one of the most significant players now in the whole game?
I would say he is. Yes, I think he is. And the Premier of Alberta often has been. You were very friendly with Peter Law. He had great influence. Ralph Klein had a fair amount of influence at one time. So the social credit people were sort of dogs in the manger in those days. Ernest Manning was quite a sort of pillar of the Canadian political establishment after he'd been the premier for 25 years or something. But yes, I think Jason is, and he deserves to be. He's a very talented, capable man. I've very high regard for him.
I'll jump now to another area. When you talked about Greta, the grim one, there's an element of that.
Grim little one. There's something, I don't want to,
be careful.
There's something about the imagery that is particularly absurd, but anyway.
But no, there's the element that I'd like to select out of that now is that here you have the most advanced civilization, and that's what it is, that the world has ever seen. We're into the computer age and space technologies, all of this wonderful stuff, product of reason and product of strict disciplines of science and inquiry. And yet we have this vast irrationality coexisting with it. And I think the career, this is where I'm moving, the career of the last couple of years of Jordan Peterson, who seems to be the lone voice saying that these old structures have purpose and meaning, and you go the other place at considerable jeopardy.
Yes.
Why are we simultaneously it's almost Middle Ages, superstitious. I'm using that term. And at the same time, look at what you're doing here even now. These instruments didn't exist, 50, 60 years ago.
Like you raise a terribly important and valid question, and I am afraid that any answer I would give would be a bit glib, and I don't want to get into that kind of thing. It requires a great deal of serious analysis. Shooting from the hip, I would say that it was a convenient and almost accidental weak point of attack for people who, for one reason or another, don't like society as it is and don't like the direction it's in. And let us face the fact that, and it's a perfectly understandable fact, that while most people in the Western world were relieved at the end of the Cold War and the relaxation of tensions and the disintegration of the Soviet military and espionage threat, it conferred a fear in a great many people that there was a sort of triumphalism in capitalist materialism that was undeserved and unattractive. So it made, I think, our society susceptible to an exaggerated amount of self-criticism, and this happened to be the strongest element within that galaxy. The people focused on the environment and how we had to treat the environment better, and then it you're pushing on an open door, and it leads to saving the planet, the whole evils of spoliation, the magnificence of nature being challenged and compromised, and so on. So it's kind of an easy case to make in a way, but what I find more surprising and more disappointing is the failure to produce more Jordan Peterson. I mean, not men of Jordan's intelligence and courage, which are both very high. He's a friend of mine too, but just a greater reticence about, wait a minute here. Just before we declare that Canada, which produces under 2% of the world's carbon footprint, announces that the greatest policy challenge in this country,
I can't get that.
when, as we've just said, 2 regions are basically threatening to secede, is fighting climate change. I mean, how do you fight the climate? It's like King Lear shaking his fist at the clouds. I mean, it's nonsense. What are we doing? Why is this happening? It's like an episode of Car 54, Where Are You? Where the one guy says, where are we going? What are we? And the answer was, nobody knows.
But it is. It's the most revered policy in so many circles, and people get so warm and they rush off to Madrid and Rio de Janeiro.
Well, you're referring to Michael Bloomberg campaigning for president in Madrid.
It's a strange phenomenon.
That's a strange one. Right?
I'd like to go back to Mr. Peterson. I interviewed him on this as well. What is he saying that has received such a vast response and such an intense response emotionally from some people?
Well, I think it's more my impression is it's not so much on the environment as
it isn't,
as on some of the gender things, and of course he officially became a controversial person over his refusal to alter his vocabulary to address people claiming
he refused that it should be mandated that I have to be forced to say things, and I will not, as he made very, very clear. Yeah. But from that point, the tour, the speeches, the book, he accelerated into a domain of intellectual stimulation. I suppose since maybe Northrop Frye or McLuhan or someone. So what is it?
And he replaced Rob Ford as the most famous Canadian in the world.
There was a tragedy. Why? What is he? What again? What was absent from all those people who have moved to him that he found? What was he saying?
I think he was putting a viewpoint that the intellectual community had shunned, or in any case not espoused, in an intellectual way, and with very recondite cultural references to our cultural history, and he was a pioneer in that, in basically invoking all manner of sources from Shakespeare and a whole range of great cultural figures. In support of an unconventional position.
Also, he wasn't...
Mind you, his book, I did not find I didn't find his book to be as profound as just speaking with him or listening to him.
He's a very intense speaker, but I think the other things there is that he's not apologetic. I don't mean you shouldn't apologize when you do things wrong. You shouldn't. But he hasn't got this embrace of submission as a form of virtue advertisement. And he says there are great things going on. Great minds have spoken. There are minds in the past we should listen to. There are lessons that are permanent. To say such things, they're truisms, all of them. Mm-hmm. But in this new world that we seem to have walked into, the truisms are a shock.
Yes.
I can't get that.
That's because everything that is traditional has become
abnormal.
And also somewhat disdained.
Yeah, oh yeah.
As humdrum, and probably false anyway. And so there's this constant quest for something new, and 3/4 of it isn't considered properly and isn't really. I mean, let us face facts. What these people are saying is that there are more than two sexes, but there aren't. Now, the sexuality of each individual, has a tremendous range. Nothing wrong with that, and every person is entitled to work that out for themselves. But to say that there are more than two sexes is just nonsense.
Well, there was a petition, an article. I think it was in some fairly droopy Canadian magazine that. They want to apply now to establish human status for the orca. I mean, we're now going to jump the species.
The whale.
Yeah, they want.
They may be superior to us in many ways, not just physical strength.
I hope they are.
Yeah. Well, my wife is in favor of interspecies marriage. She wants to. If anything happens to me, she wants to marry her male dog.
One last point, then I'll let you go. I've kept you a long while.
No, you haven't kept me at all.
I'm not fast. I like and admire Mr. Peterson very much. I don't know as you do. If any other Canadian, and we must use italics again, intellectual, had reached the stratosphere as profoundly as he has, I think every magazine in this particular city and in Canada generally will be running profiles, and camera crews will be going around day and night celebrating we have a great Canadian in our midst, and he's a star of the world.
Don't underestimate Canadian envy. Unless you're a popular musician or an athlete, your success is apt to be severely resented. And Canada is a terribly envious country. I mean, I remember when, I don't remember it from the time, but a very prominent person in the Canadian Foreign Service, very admired person. In fact, there's no reason not to mention it, Alan Gottlieb, who was an excellent ambassador in Washington, told me that when Mr. Pearson was awarded the Nobel Prize, the widespread reaction, even in the External Affairs Department of Canada, was, how dare he? Who does he think he is? Mike Pearson, the Nobel Prize. Who does he think he is? You see, and
dear God.
Canadians. Look, I remember when I was a young person, we'd go to the movie theaters in the weekend, and then they had the news filmed before.
Yeah.
On television wasn't so widespread then. That's how long ago it was, in the 50s. And so you'd see, Canada wins a bronze medal at the Winter Olympics. I mean, everyone would cheer. It was a country so starved for real success its self-esteem had to a large degree been occupied by the British and Americans, countries with which it was closely associated. That it's taken a long time for Canada to develop a normal national ego, and it isn't quite there yet, in my opinion. I mean, even this pattern we have, we had this extraordinary thing where, for 92 years, from 1856 to 1948. John A. Macdonald, Wilfrid Laurier, and Mackenzie King were either Prime Minister of the United Province of Canada and then the Dominion, or Leader of the Opposition. An astounding thing, 3 people. And 65 years, the Leader of the government between the 3 of them. And And then, since then, we have this pattern of, Mr. Saleron won a big majority and then was pushed out. Mr. Diefenbaker, the country went for him, cock a hoop, then he was pushed out. Pierre Trudeau got a huge victory in '68. He almost lost. Then he did lose to Joe Clark, of all people. And if he hadn't brought John Turner in to take the bullet for him, he really would have been defeated. Mulroney came in, Brian came in with a very strong majority, and when he left, his popularity was in single figures, quite unjustly, in my opinion. And that is the pattern here, and that's not how it happens elsewhere,
Yeah.
I mean, they have term limits in the United States, but Dwight Eisenhower and Ronald Reagan and even Bill Clinton at the end of 2 terms were still quite popular.
Yep, and Clinton especially, because he was under fire for his dalliance.
Well, he wasn't as distinguished as the other two.
No, not at all.
Either. Now, Roosevelt took 4 straight terms. He could have elected himself as long as he wanted to.
I think my best statistical thing for the American election, you probably already know this, is that the New York Times had its little prediction clock.
96%.
They gave Hillary a half an hour before the vote closed. They had Hillary at 92%, Trump at 8%.
Yes.
Bloomberg had another clock. They had Hillary 98%.
Yes.
The press, whose only expertise is the knowledge of the country that they write about, was upside down.
Yeah.
I mean,
completely. This has no relevance to anything, but no one in Canada watches an American election on Canadian television.
No one does.
But the Canadian networks have to cover it.
Of course they do.
So CTV, in their desperation, thrashing about to find somebody in this country who is reasonably civil in reference to Trump, invited me on, you see. So at the beginning, there were about 10 of us, you see, chaired by the venerable Lloyd Robertson. A very fine man. And so they said, well, what are your predictions? The polls are now just closing in Kentucky and Indiana. They're the first 2 states. So before we get any results, let's have a prediction. So I said, well, I think that Mrs. Clinton will win the popular vote, but Mr. Trump will win the Electoral College. And will be elected. And they looked at me as if I had 2 heads, you see. And that is... We get 15 minutes off in the green room each hour, so you see all the other networks. You see, Wolf Blitzer used to work for us at the Jerusalem Post, scrambling around like a roach, saying, "Well, we can still win this game," and they're getting more and more desperate. You see. And they kept thinning the ranks, and finally it was Lloyd and me and the anchors. Everybody, all the other, all the Hillary worshippers were dismissed. You see. And my wife recorded the highlights. There was one of them was they were holding, I don't know if you remember this, Wisconsin for the longest time. And I said, look, Trump's leading Wisconsin by 85,000 votes with 93% of the polls reporting now, unless every single poll not reporting is in the African-American districts of Milwaukee. He's going to win Wisconsin, and that'll give him the election. They wouldn't hear it. And finally, they were sort of debating with the anchors, were agreeing with themselves that they were still up in the air. It was too close to call. When one of the guys from behind, one of the camera guys, came out and started sort of waving his arms around and pointing at the board, showing they finally handed Wisconsin to Trump and he won the election.
Well, I'm going to stop it there, but I want to say to you very much, I appreciated you coming to talk to me, and thank you very much.
My pleasure, Rex.